All right, spirit communication. This is Dan,
And this is Kat.
and today we're going to be talking a little bit about tips and tricks for getting to create and work with spirit. Sometimes mediumship can seem a little daunting, and there's certainly a lot of tutorials on mediumship and a lot of discussion around mediumship.
Hmm.
But Kat and I feel like there's actually a lot of room for experimentation in mediumship, as well as certain beginner or intermediate tools which can increase the clarity around messages.
Exactly. These are our tried and true methods and things we've learned about and researched. And I think they're pretty simple. You can advance in many different ways as we're going to go into a little bit later in this lecture. But these are just spirit communication techniques.
Exactly. So the methods and tools that we're going to be discussing are ones that we think are like really hands-on and useful because there's this idea in mediumship frequently that mediumship is either all mental or all physical or all evidential, and it requires spirits literally talking into your head somehow um, to impart messages. And maybe that's a trope that we see in like TV shows with like Teresa Caputo, where she goes into her like a crowded grocery store and sees spirits and interacts with them. We're not
Hmm.
saying that doesn't happen, but I
Hmm.
think it sets unrealistic expectations for
Hmm.
individuals about what mediumship can be.
Yeah, and everyone receives spirit communication in different ways. We shouldn't limit it to just hearing voices in your head or seeing literal specters.
Exactly. Plus, there's an element of spirit communication that works throughout magic. And I think these tools, these methods, which we're going to be discussing, have more magical application than simply just mediumship as far as receiving a message from a departed spirit or a survival of some departed consciousness.
Hmm.
These are tools which you will find have cross compatibility with journeying,
Hmm.
with entity communication, with subconscious communication and shadow work.
Exactly. Yes, especially with looking at pendulums is great for that subconscious communication and also energy clearing work. So a lot of these do double work, really.
Exactly. And so we encourage you, if you have not engaged with them, to engage with dreaming, pendulum, scrying, automatic writing, augury, and omens. These are things to explore.
Absolutely.
So before you set down with any one of these potential items to practice with, what's the praxis?
Yes. What are the procedures to help make this effective for you? So a lot of them have a lot of the methods we laid out in the previous slides have commonalities that are laid out in these 5 steps. So, step one, you're going to want to set an intention for your session, coming with a clear goal or question in mind. This helps to frame how the communication is going to come to you. This helps you focus on the messages that you want to receive, which is really important if you're looking for communicating with a specific spirit or answering a specific question.
And if you do any work with tarot divination, divination, you already know how important the question is. The
Mm.
question or the intention, the framing of that, I always think is at least half the battle with
Yes,
getting a good message.
I agree.
So sitting down to ask for spirit like messages, just show me something, can be fun,
Mhm.
and experiment, have fun with that. But saying show me something, uh, that's going to open up not a door or a portal, but it doesn't provide any real clarification for spirit. So spirit can
Mhm.
certainly show you something, and you might either miss it or it might just have no actual practical application.
Yeah.
um, so it would be similar to reading tarot and saying, um, what's in my future? Well, that's a lot for 3 tarot cards or a full Celtic Cross tarot spread to unpack. The
Mhm.
same is true for spirit. So that step one, getting that intention, is important.
Mhm. Yes, and spirit communication is a magical practice. So intention setting is an important first step, I think, in any magical practice.
Exactly. Since we're engaging with necromancy, step two here is literally setting up protections. These can include anything you're familiar with as far as protection is concerned. It can be a lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, visualization of white light, creation of a circle.
Hmm.
When you're inviting things in to communicate, we of course want to set some ground rules. So,
Hmm.
Kat, why don't we talk a little bit about the ground rules we set before we do some sort of spirit invocation?
Oh, right. That makes sense. Well, I mean, for a seance, we bring certain tools.
Hmm.
I know you have a talisman.
Hmm.
What's that again?
It's a Solomonic
Um,
sigil or seal that is only to allow in or call in benevolent spirits or
mhm,
good energies.
mhm. So we use that. We also have protective salts,
Hmm.
which we lay around the tools that we use as a protective circle.
Exactly.
What else do we do?
Well, in our day to day, we do a lot of mediumship and we do a lot of spirit communication. So, in our window, we have a mason jar full of St. John's wort that hangs there. And that's kind of like a spiritual burglar alarm, if you will. That's there to just kind of protect against any entity intrusion or spiritual intrusion. I have a daily practice, which is a variation on the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, which deals explicitly with Akati and her four kind of servants, which guard the four cardinal directions. I know, Kat, you've said in the past that you do a lot of work with like white light
Mhm.
visualization, what would classically be referred to as the middle pillar.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And that I do every night. I find that my practicing this nightly is really good, um, has been really beneficial for me.
Yes, if you're engaging in any kind of spiritual communication or necromancy, it is important to have a daily ritual banishing practice, one that
Mm-hmm.
you can rely on and go to as your go to. And you can build that out as you desire. If you're doing a seance like we are, we build that out with seals and sigils and salts. But if we're doing a one on one mediumship reading, maybe we're just doing a banishing cleansing with a pendulum and our own visualization techniques. So once we've cleared and banished
Mm-hmm.
everything, now we begin to call in.
Yes, we call in the good spirits, the positive spirits, and the good energies. And we also call in guides or invoke our own guides to facilitate spirit communication. Um, this includes entities, ancestors, angels, anything that's really going to want to give us positive and also clear messages. I always ask that the messages are understandable because otherwise it can get too murky.
Exactly. This is something which we come up to again and again when we discuss spirit boards or Ouija boards. Um, Sometimes the problem with spirit or Ouija boards is not necessarily their history. There's certainly a pop culture like negative consciousness surrounding them, even though I think that's quite unfair. It's literally that the messages are often rather unclear.
Mhm.
And that can be an issue of framing a question, but it can also just be the fact that using that kind of physical interface with the spiritual world results in murky messages.
Mhm.
So having that clarity of invoking guides and spirit, which you've or entities that you feel you've worked with and who kind of facilitate that path for you,
Right.
is going to be extremely helpful.
Yes. And so for this looks like literally us saying aloud, um, please, positive guides, angels, my ancestors, communicate with us, interact with us, make yourselves known. Usually say it out loud, but if I'm doing automatic writing, that process is going to be written out.
Right. And now we have, you also see this, I think I should point out with automatic writing, there was it was traditional to put like the sign of the cross on the top of the automatic writing parchment, which is that
Oh,
same like invocational invoking guide. We obviously don't need to do that. You can use a sigil if you want, a sign that's
yes.
been relayed to you.
That's not a bad idea.
No,
Translating the invocation into a sigil could be really powerful.
yeah, I think so.
Ooh.
So now step 4, meditation and reception of inputs from spirit. Um, it can be very exciting to receive messages from spirit. And I think first timers or intermediate mediums or people working with necromancy or spirit communication can get overly excited about messages coming in. And what ends up happening is a excitement that diffuses the actual connection. I like to think about this in similar ways to anyone who's ever done lucid dreaming. Um, if you are an avid lucid dreamer or have explored lucid dreaming or astral projection, one of the first things you kind of have to learn in that experiential state is that you just need to passively observe what's happening and exert your will and kind of create in that space. But if you get super excited and be like, oh my goodness, it's happening, I'm astral projecting, I'm lucid dreaming, you immediately wake up.
Mm,
The same is kind of true in this.
mm. That is so hard not to get excited
Yeah.
about it. I would say that once you've really, really practiced it, you can allow yourself to feel those emotions because you know how to stay in it. You know how
Hmm.
to stay in that meditative and receptive state. But yes, for beginners or I think even intermediate, like it can absolutely throw you off because you're starting to really process that and digest that message in a way that turns on a different part of your brain instead of just receiving. And maybe I know for us, we don't always understand the visual inputs that are coming to us, and we are just receptive and then explaining that in a very basic way without putting our values and judgments on that.
Exactly. Similarly, you can get messages from spirit that aren't particularly useful or helpful. Spirits don't always know the answer to every question, and I think it's important that we
It's
kind
true.
of mention that here. So, getting wrapped up in what spirit messages are coming through, they may have emotional valence for you. It may not be the message you want to hear. It may be something you don't want. You really wished the answer was different or the message was different. Simply to the best that we can, we just try to observe and record these things as they come in and don't interpret them or assign meaning to them.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly because spirits like can be wrong. They don't have perfect knowledge. They're a lot like, I always say, a lot like your mom. They know you. They've known you since you were really, really young. They might have more context for you, but they can still be wrong and they can still have the wrong ideas about your life.
Exactly. They might have more perspective because
Hmm.
of where they are, um, but they don't necessarily have the right answer. And they might not also have the answer that you needed to hear just then. I would say maybe with angels and guides that there might be a little more clarity there.
There may be. And even with angels and guides, I still think it's worth understanding that these things have their own intent and maybe their own will.
That's
And so
true.
that's
And there's
something which we
only
need to
so
measure.
much that we can really comprehend about them
Right.
in
So we
our
take the time
space.
to record and not really in the moment try and make sense of these
Mm-hmm.
things. Later, we can examine those messages, which brings us to step 5.
Yes. Okay. Step 5 is ending it properly,
Hmm.
closing the circle, banishing, which sounds really harsh, but it's what needs to happen.
Yeah. And the banishing can be as simple as saying, thank you for coming
Yes.
here, speaking with us, giving us these messages. Now, please, go back on your way and respect my
Right.
boundaries.
It's like having house guests and it's getting later and you have work in the morning and you say, oh, well, thank you for coming.
Exactly. Exactly. Boy, is it getting late. So then now is the time to kind of rework and examine both the praxis, like what were your steps? How did these steps interface with the tools you were using? Because this will look about the same whether you're scrying or using a pendulum or divining augury or even just like waiting for mental messages. Um, but how did the tools plug in? Did you feel comfortable with the tools? Did the tools seem more or less effective than other tools in other sessions?
Hmm.
And then really seeing those messages and kind of taking a space outside of this active contact to say, well, now does this make sense? Is there something of value here? Is
Hmm.
there something that works with my goals?
Yeah, and if you're doing this with another person or a group of people, it can be a really good idea to open up and talk about that experience because it can be so impactful and emotional. You're going to want to check in with everyone.
Yeah, following any ritual, any magical ritual, it can be very useful to have that wind down time where everyone just eats, comes
Yep,
back, feels a little bit more
absolutely.
centered.
Yes, I know for me when I do mediumship, it's so useful for me to just like ground myself through eating or drinking or just like, okay, I'm here now.
Exactly.
Okay.
So let's dig into these different modalities a little bit more fully. The
Mhm.
first is, I think, one of the most common, I really do,
Yeah.
which is the world of dreams and spirit contact via dreams.
Oh, yes. This one is probably the best one because you're already doing
Yeah,
it. You're
yes.
already dreaming, most likely. And this is a great way for the universe to send messages to you already. So, this is you just sort of sitting back, sleeping, and making sure that you are paying attention to the messages that come through dreaming. So the first thing you want to do if you want specific spirit contact through dreams is set your intention. And you can either write or say that aloud. Say
Hmm.
you would like to contact your grandmother who has passed away. You're going to want to say, I want to speak with my grandma Betty tonight. I would love for her to meet me in my dreams, and I would like to discuss this part of my experience with her. And as clear as you really want it to be, or as vague as you want it to be, I would say.
Yeah. Once the spirits kind of make themselves known in dreams, there's this element of then recording the details and the symbolic language. One of the reasons dreams can be so fascinating and dream interpretation can be so useful is that the brain seems to speak in some kind of symbolic language. That's the whole like theory on which sigils and seals are kind of rest. That's why it's all kind of built on.
Mm,
And we find for our work that spirit communicates extremely well through symbology.
yeah.
So the dreams are like a natural fit. And it is considered a form of mental manifestation, but it's super accessible. You may have already even had a dream that involved a loved one or a spirit contact. Now, the question we often get then is, well, how do I know that this is quote unquote, and I'm doing the air quotes here, real and not just a dream? The answer is I feel it's the feeling. It's the difference between, uh, it's the difference again to go back to lucid dreaming, it's or astral projection. It's the difference between dreaming about astral projection or dreaming about lucid dreaming and actually having a dream in which you're lucid and know, oh, I am dreaming. There's a difference in clarity. There's a difference in sharpness. There's a difference in the surroundings of the dream. So, for example, if a spirit comes to work with you in a dream, it's very unlikely that that spirit is going to, look like someone who it isn't. So, for example, in like a dream state, there's that like, oh, I was with Kat, but Kat looked like, I don't know, my next door neighbor. Like dreams are weird like that sometimes.
That's weird.
In yeah, and this is a hypothetical. Um, but in spirit, there's like, your your departed loved one shouldn't have the face of a frog. Like we'll put it that way. Like there's a
There's a
real
clarity
a
there.
clarity, a sense of knowing, a sense of presence,
Hmm.
and importantly, a sense of operant will on the end of the person who's visiting, the spirit that's visiting. Um, Again, in dreams that feeling of things which are just kind of unmoored and happening versus doing a ritual and there's an felt presence of like knowledge and intent that's in the room with you. That would be the same with dreams. I hope
Mm.
that's not too confusing. Talking about
No.
dreams is really hard.
um, One thing that I found challenging with interpreting dreams and spirit communication through dreams is the ability to process that once you're awake.
Hmm.
And that means a little bit of time once you've woken to remember your dreams. And if you're going for a more long term conversation, you're going to have to record those dreams. And I found that very tedious and something that I don't actually want to do when I wake up.
Right. And so if you find that dreams don't work for you, there are other things to explore. Again, these are options to explore. Um, but bear in mind, again, dreaming is one of the things which I feel is most common, and people have already kind of dipped their toe in spirit communication through dreams. Historically, it's one of the oldest and most popular forms of spirit communication in religious texts, where people have dreams and gods or entities or spirits come to tell them things and give them specialized knowledge. One of the oldest ghost stories ever written from Pliny the Younger has to do extensively with a spirit visitation that occurs in a dream, and the spirit directs the dreamer to a location where the spirit's earthly remains are improperly buried. So there's this kind of precedent throughout human history for spirit and dream as a um, kind of like a train station to meet
A
spirits to
liminal space in
oh,
your brain,
exactly.
for sure.
So if dreams aren't working though, let's go on to pendulums.
We love pendulums. We think this is one of the second most accessible ways to communicate with spirit. Um, Anyone can do this at any
Mm-hmm.
time. And it's a simple way to establish a yes no binary with whatever spirits that you are interacting with. It's a simple form of communication that is dependent on the swings of a pendulum, either clockwise, counterclockwise, left, or right.
Exactly. Or even
Wait,
just a
up and down.
paused stillness as well.
Yes.
So this idea of using the pendulum for spirit communication is extremely practical. It's found in a lot of folkloric traditions, as well as the history of spiritualism to a great degree. When the Theosophical societies began to spring up and kind of investigate this world with a kind of 19th century scientific lens, pendulums were used as a almost like an early EVP or EMF detector. Today, we find that they're still extremely useful, and they're useful insofar as they don't have the negative associations that maybe a Ouija board does. The spirit communication is quite localized. It's quite small with the pendulum, and the pendulums themselves can be made of different metaphysical stones or crystals that have properties which are protecting in and of themselves. So we have a pendulum that's made out of selenite, which is a purifying and very like protective crystal that we feel very comfortable using. And we specifically use it in our seances to communicate with angelic beings or good beings or benevolent energies or spirits. So there's this real low barrier to entry, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and pendulums can be made out of other things
Mm-hmm.
too that are more accessible. It can be made out of string, shoestring tied to a weighted object like a key,
Mm-hmm.
or some necklaces even can work as a pendulum if you've got that weighted object at the bottom and you're holding like a longer length of chain or string at the very top. And you're going to just want to hold it with your thumb and first finger and just keep your arm still
Mm-hmm.
and go ahead and ask those questions. And those questions might have to do with um, do I have permission to communicate with spirits in this space right now?
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a really helpful way to open up that conversation to see just where the baseline energies are.
Exactly. And if you've used a pendulum before, you know they can be used for energy clearing, for closing circles, for banishings.
Mm-hmm.
So a pendulum can really be like an all-in-one kind of session for spirit
Yes.
communication. You can literally open the session by asking the pendulum to swing in a counterclockwise direction. And once, as it swings, to absorb the negative energy in the room and to release it into, the universe where it will not harm anyone,
Mm-hmm.
and then go directly into a spirit communication session, and then ask the pendulum to spin counterclockwise or reverse, to then close those channels of communication.
Mm-hmm.
If you're using a pendulum for spirit communication, we do find that it's generally best to use the one pendulum for spirit communication for only spirit communication. So not using a spirit communication pendulum to go and then do dowsing or to do
Mm,
divination.
that's right.
However, if you feel you must, it's okay to do so. It's just these things build their own memories. They learn their function, they learn their
Yeah.
purpose.
They almost become like a talisman.
They do. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Like I carry my pendulum with me for that purpose.
Yes. You can also use it to help you find lost things,
Yes.
which has been useful for many. I do want to mention that this can act as a direct link with both the world of spirits that are more outside of you. I won't say fully outside of you because
Hmm.
I'm not sure that I believe that. But it also can act as a tell you what's in your subconscious.
Yes.
I know that Isabel told us a few times where she used the pendulum to find out where her energy levels were to see if she was going to do a project right then or not.
Hmm.
And sometimes the pendulum would indicate, like, no, because sometimes we don't know these things about ourselves. And pendulums are a really, really good way to make this information clear.
Exactly. Sometimes we get people asking, much like dreaming, how do I know that the pendulum is moving itself, or that this is picking up on subconscious energy or spiritual contact versus me just moving the pendulum? The answer again is you will know. There's a distinct difference, and in fact, you may encounter when you first start using a pendulum some element of physical exertion over it, a temptation or a desire to slightly move your hand to kind of create movement in the pendulum. But there is a distinct switch that feels like a crossing of a threshold or a switch being flipped, where there's the
Mm-hmm.
pendulum moving of its own volition versus the pendulum moving because we're secretly moving our hands back and forth to get the
Yeah.
answers we want. And that can be tricky because it's not always like a thought process, but it's definitely, you will note the difference. The pendulum moves in a different way. There's a
Mm-hmm.
difference of feeling and thought.
And it will be very clear if you're focusing on your question,
Exactly.
because you're supposed to hold it out and focus on what you want to know, not about, I am moving this a specific way.
Exactly. When I ask a question to a pendulum, when I ask a question to spirit, I will often close my eyes
Yes,
because
yeah.
I don't really want to know the direction the pendulum is moving until I feel from spirit that that the message has been sent and
Mm-hmm.
received.
Mm-hmm.
And then I open my eyes and look to see how is the pendulum interacting
Yeah.
with that spirit message.
Yes. Very good tips. Scrying.
Okay, time for scrying. This is
Okay.
one of the most fun.
I love
I
scrying.
love scrying so
I
much.
don't do it enough.
No, and I am constantly trying to get better at it because it is, if any of these things feel like magic, and they all kind of
Mm-hmm.
do,
They do.
scrying feels the most magic because scrying is where we see physical manifestation with regularity.
Scrying is the weird.
Scrying is when you look in and something looks back at you, and that is a very, very weird space to
It is
occupy.
fantastic.
So, a note about scrying, try it. If you're not good at it, that's okay. There are a million other things to do here.
Mm-hmm.
I want to be clear up front. Not everyone can be a seer.
Some
Um,
people just don't get the visual inputs like
exactly.
other people do, just as people think in different ways.
Hmm. And this is that's the reason why historically there are seers, and then there are people who interpret for seers, and then there are people who just cannot make it go. A good
Mm-hmm.
example of this is, of course, is John Dee and his work with seeing stones and with seers, uh, which heavily influenced Enochian magic and the magic that we kind of see around the 19th century. So this concept of being able to gaze into a crystal, a black mirror, a scrying surface, or simply a bowl full of water to receive visions and messages, it is very bizarre. But again, don't be discouraged if it doesn't work for you. There are other methods which might work very, very well for you.
But try it.
But please try it.
Try it. It takes, how long does it take?
It takes about 10 to 15 minutes to see something come through.
Oh my
And what
gosh,
you
I
want...
would say like 15 or more.
For me, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes, but give it at least 15 to 20 if it's your first time. And you do not need a fancy surface for this. You can go out and buy an obsidian scrying mirror,
Yes.
and that's fine. But there are stories of people literally looking into quartz crystals to see things. There are stories of people looking into crystal balls, which are made of like acrylic or, an artificial crystal ball.
Mhm.
The chaos magician Gordon White has an incredible story about his teenage years and using an acrylic crystal ball
Mhm.
uh,
With much success.
with much success. And we use in our seances and for personal use, we literally have a mirror we bought at a Goodwill, took the glass out, took the glass off the front, spray painted the mirror surface black, and then put it back into the mirror with the glass on top. And we used like a really like shiny, really shiny black gloss paint.
Mm.
And that works for me probably better than any scrying surface I've ever tried. However, there are stories of people literally being able to scry in black fingernail polish. So you can try whatever you like for this.
Make it easy. Don't try the black fingernail polish right away.
Yeah, don't do that right away. But there are stories of this. So you
There
can,
are.
I just want to stress this can be a very accessible form of spirit
Mhm.
communication. It literally can just be a shallow bowl full of water, and maybe a few drops of black ink in it. Like
Mhm.
it does not have to be expensive.
Or the inside of your bowl could be darkly colored or black
Yes.
for that water. Um, yes, so this is an excellent way to communicate with not just spirits of departed loved ones or spirits of humans, but more than human entities as well.
Yes, this is where we get into like angel communication. And by angel communication, I do not mean like fluffy new age angels that are, look cherubic and beautiful. I mean like the bundles of eyes kind of angels. So be aware that things will appear. And sometimes it's not just entities, sometimes it's visions of landscapes or scenes. What generally happens is as you, let's set up our scrying surface. What generally happens is you want to set up your scrying surface with a small single light. I generally
Mhm.
use a tea candle, or Kat will as well, or maybe if we're feeling a little bit more ritually oriented, a beautiful like ritual candle. And turn out all the lights, and have your indirect light source with your scrying mirror not reflecting anything. So have it angled, your scrying surface angled so that in the mirror, you don't see anything. You don't see
Mhm.
yourself, the bookcase behind you,
Or the candle,
or the
right?
candle.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then you wait. A soft focus. You've done your invocations, and we're just waiting to see. And what should happen is about 10 to 20 minutes in, depending on
Very good.
your level of skill, the amount of time you've done this before, etc. You should begin to feel things within the room, and there should be a kind of fog which appears inside the crystal. It should look like with smoke. That's actually what most people report when we do our seances.
That's true. Yeah. And we don't actually tell them that before that
No,
happens.
no, it's funny because we at this point hardly draw any attention to our scrying surface, and
Right.
people report seeing objects in it, movement in it, especially when Kat is channeling.
Mhm.
But most people, if we pass around a crystal ball, will be looking into it, and they rarely give themselves enough time. I think there's a pressure there because you're in a ritual circle and you don't want to take 10 to 15 minutes each. But those who are pretty adept will look into it and say, "Oh my goodness, I see smoke in there," and
Mhm.
that's the beginning of the communication.
In truth, we would never start with that. So we
Hmm.
are kind of getting them in that space, and we've created that liminal space, and so it's able to manifest more quickly.
Yeah, And seances are like ritual superconductors for spirit
Indeed,
communication.
which
So
is why we do them.
exactly. So once you have something coming through the mirror, just will kind of see what comes through.
That's right.
This is where things get fun. It might be a it might be a departed spirit you're familiar with. It may be an entity that you work with. It may be an entity that wants to communicate with you. Uh, boundaries and rules apply. So if something comes through that's gross, just tell it to go away and leave. Like, you don't have to tolerate
Mm-mm.
images or messages from things you don't want to tolerate. You're kind of in control here. And then when you're done, make sure you banish. This is probably one of the tools in which banishing is, in a sense of importance, most important. And there's mirror and mirror magic protection spells and sigils, which Kat and I use on our scrying surfaces, because they literally are little viewports into
Little
different
tiny
places.
portals.
Yes. So when we do our lecture, which the recording is either up already if this is after the 14th, or will be up on April 14th, about curses and counter curses, we will be discussing counter curses around mirrors and mirror surfaces. So that applies here.
Absolutely. Did you want to mention the psychomantium?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Well, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, a psychomantium is the best place to do scrying. Basically, the psychomantium is just a very dark room, enclosed space. It's almost as if you were like going to record a podcast or something. But instead of capturing the sound, you're capturing all the light in that room. And you might have that one candle just maybe even behind your head, and you're looking at the mirror in this kind of darkly colored, hopefully maybe even black, totally black room. And it's a room dedicated for the scrying purpose. So it's got kind of ritual.
Yeah, it's almost like a magical sensory deprivation chamber.
Oh, that's a good description.
Which can really help you kind of fine tune these messages. I'll also point out here for scrying, scrying is one of the few forms of communication that we're discussing where ritual fasting is useful, as is like clean living. And of course, there's a lot of like weirdness baked into this due to the types of people who are engaging in scrying sessions, generally monks, generally people with like a kind of religious aptitude who had an obsession with purity or with a non-fallen state. I'm a little suspicious of those narratives. However, I have found that specifically when working with angels or entities, a clean lifestyle for the purpose of scrying leading up to scrying does, for whatever reason, amplify that messaging. But you don't have to do it. It's just something to be aware of. You get better quality of communication, and I find better quality of entity if you come into it in a state where you've done some ritual fasting or a ritual bath or something beforehand.
Okay. So clean living is like not only hygiene, but what you put in your body.
Yeah.
Is that, and fasting from,
Yeah, this is,
all sorts of fun things.
I would imagine like fasting from the fun things. So this is like,
Fasting from the fun.
cutting out the sugar,
The
practicing
alcohol.
abstinence,
Boo.
booze, yeah, those drugs, these things generally, not that there's not a place for any of those things or all of those things in magic, because there is,
100%.
but for the express purpose of scrying, and then for the doubly express purpose of scrying with angelic creatures or entities,
Yep.
this fasting or ritual component is helpful.
I do think they appreciate that too.
I do. And it's just better. I find it's better to talk with an entity that's benevolent or benefic towards humanity or interested in us more so than talking with like, just an angry bundle of eyes.
Oh boy.
So yeah, experiment, find what works for you.
Wait, final thing.
Yes.
For psychomantium, the only other tip I have, obviously you can totally create your own in the closet or something like that, but have a comfortable chair, just not too comfortable.
Yeah.
Because you will fall asleep.
You will definitely fall asleep. Automatic writing. This is, if scrying does not work for you, that's fine because you might be a great automatic writer.
Yes. So this is less about visuals and more about hearing and writing down those messages. Automatic writing is something we've been using in seance for a few years now, and I think it's been really, really successful.
It has been.
Um,
There's a real lineage with automatic writing. There's certainly this surrealist or Dadaist element where the focus was on creating art or channeling messages in a purely receptive state, moving entirely with the subconscious. And that artistic movement, as you'll find from our occult history discussions, art and the occult are intimately intertwined.
mm-hmm.
So a lot of the like surrealist movements had a great deal of influence on the occult and vice versa. So originally, automatic writing was very scratchy looking, almost indecipherable, very big, bold, and frustrating for the, I think, the non-writer to try and understand.
I'm sure frustrating for the writer too, because you're in a different receptive state and not necessarily remembering all that you're saying.
Exactly. However, this has shifted over time as surrealist movements and art have kind of unwound themselves from magic and from spirit communication. Automatic writing has kind of flourished within like a new age, like a self-development kind of sphere. It doesn't have to be explicitly related to spirit contact, although Kat and I believe it is, and we use it as such.
Mm-hmm.
So if your automatic writing is not messy and is not looking like something out of The Changeling, which I guess maybe we should link that scene, that's okay. Kat's automatic writing is, her penmanship, I think, is beautiful. She has great handwriting, and that holds true while she's doing automatic writing. And maybe you should explain a little bit about what automatic writing feels like for you
mm-hmm.
and why it comes out the way it does for you.
Yeah, so it honestly depends on your handwriting and how much you've practiced handwriting. I do a lot of journaling, so my handwriting just comes out naturally a specific way. But it is a little bit, I will contradict you a little bit.
Sure.
It is a little bit messier than my normal writing, and I think it should be. We were talking about historic instances of automatic writing. Going back into the beginning of the seance, as we know it today, starting in the 1850, late 1800s, automatic writing was considered the spirits literally moving your hand. So the mediums would not even hear the messages. It wouldn't go through any sort of mental area except for us so far as their hand was moved by the spirits. So they would hold the pens really loosely and their arms would move to create these hopefully words and sentences. Today, we see it more almost as a free associative exercise, and you can make an argument that if set the intention that you're going to communicate with higher self, the universe, God, whatever, it can be considered automatic writing. And so that is what I do in the seance. I set the intention to have this, to open up this conversation with spirit that wants to come through in the seance. And then I wait.
And there's a real focus here on receiving messages. Mm-hmm. And those messages, there's also an element here of understanding that the reception of the message may not result in an overtly clear or pointed message.
It's very unclear.
It's very unclear.
For me, at least.
The key with automatic writing is don't force it. Don't take the message and say, this has to me. I have to make this work. I have to give this meaning and torture this channeled sentence to have meaning for me. It either will or it will not. And if it doesn't, that's okay. This is why we recommend kind of returning to our recordings of messages, because they may make sense a week out from the session. Time is weird, and I don't understand or know if spirits experience time the same way we do. So again, there's that element of receiving, and the point is the reception, maybe over the pointedness of the message.
Exactly. And so, one tip could be it depends on what works for you. But I know that Michael Sandler, in his book Awe, which is all about automatic writing, and we would recommend that work, um, he starts in his daily automatic writing process by just writing no matter what. So
Mm-hmm.
he'll literally write, I do not know what to write. I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write until something comes out of it, until he starts to like write something that is more of value, I would say. So that might be that might work well for you. He also suggests listening to a type of music. I think it's theta
Mm-hmm.
brainwave, entrainment brainwave music, or not even music, sort of
They're like
just
tones.
sounds, waves maybe, designed to get your brain in this sort of state that is best for automatic writing. I think that's all we're going to say on this for now. It's a lovely practice. It is good. I would say there is good reason for it being in a more self-help area because it is extremely helpful for healing, for contacting yourself, your highest self, and getting messages from those entities that want to help you, your guides.
Yes, which shouldn't really be a surprise because there is some kind of eschatological spirit movement about helping us, or for some spirits and entities, helping us or imparting knowledge or kind of intervening in a positive way is kind of, in many ways, seems to be like the crux of spirit communication. So it's not entirely surprising.
Exactly. Spirit communication can be a very, very helpful and healing process overall.
Yes. So now we're getting into augury, which I think we traditionally think of as like, you know, looking around in intestines for signs about the future. Yes, and augury is also just simply interpreting natural phenomena as spirit communication.
Mm-hmm.
We hear this most frequently, I think, with birds, with butterflies, people who, a popular story that we've been told on many occasions is when someone's family member has passed away, a bird appearing and sitting on their windowsill for 2 weeks before flying away. And it just so happened to be the deceased favorite bird. So that sort of thing is very much in kind of alignment with augury here.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something that's often overlooked, I think.
I think so. It's something that maybe we might have lost a little bit over time. I know that in many indigenous cultures, paying attention to what animals appear and what they're doing around you, and even weather events, were interpreted as like expressions of the universe, and it can be seen as messages to you
Mm-hmm.
specifically from the universe, which I think is a lovely concept. And augury is something that can happen at any time. I think this is the most spontaneous way of spirit communication, or way that universe is communicating to you.
Exactly. I think there's somewhat of a resistance to it in, like, again, loose brackets here, Western. That term really doesn't mean anything, but it is appropriate colloquial shorthand. This kind of pushback in Western modern thought around spirit and spiritual expression through uh, intelligences outside of ourselves. It does this worldview of like augury and spirit communication through natural phenomena does speak to an animist worldview, where there's something to like a universal spiritual mind connection, or spirit being able to impact the physical through thought, or if not thought, mind, spirit. It's very difficult to explain.
Mm-hmm.
And it may actually have some roots in a materialist like frame, which is kind of cool. When we look at things like, for example, preliminary results in psi research and psi phenomena, one of the enduring mysteries that we've read about in terms of mind-to-mind communication are large flocks of birds. If you've ever seen swallows kind of flying in a large flock where they kind of blot out almost the whole sky and they make
Mm.
these sharp turns and move together, there is an element where those creatures are behaving with some kind of hive mind in that flight. And it's not entirely understood, like how those birds know to kind of move that whole mass of birds as one mass, as in comparison to, a bunch of birds flying into each other. And you know what I'm talking about if you've seen those big groups of small, like songbirds flying that way. There is some kind of weird intra-related mental phenomena occurring. Similarly, with psi research, it shows people having physiological reactions to images on computer screens before they're shown those images. So having arousal responses to, violent images or sexual images or calming images before they're shown those images, the body kind of is already preparing and knowing what's coming next. So there's something interesting here about psi and spirit contact on a materials plane that's not being fully fleshed out, and I don't know if it ever will be. But it does speak to some kind of connection point between the spiritual world and this one.
That's really interesting. I'm gonna have to think about that one a little bit more.
Yeah, it's definitely, I think, one of my favorite things that I've recently been reading about.
Wow. Okay. Um, so augury and uh, communication through seeing or experiencing natural phenomena is often symbolic, but also pointed. So you'll know when this is a message. You'll know when this is something that you need to pay attention to. It's kind of like when I'm walking down a path and I see a bunny and I think, I love that bunny. What an adorable creature.
Mm-hmm.
And then I might be walking down a path and I see a snake and I just know, that is a message for me. That
Mm-hmm.
is either a warning for me or a message that has to do with the snake representing healing,
Mm-hmm.
as well as many other things. So you'll know when these are signs and not just noise or regular things that are happening around you that are not necessarily message for you in your life right now. And that's very similar with synchronicity, the
Exactly.
understanding of synchronicity. Also similar to what we were talking about before with dreaming. Like,
Yes.
when is the spirit communication actually coming through?
Yes, not everything has to have meaning, and just like automatic writing, we shouldn't force everything to have meaning. We can fall down a kind of synchronistic rabbit hole that just leads straight to madness if
Oh
we're trying
boy.
to say every single thing has meaning for
Yes,
us.
this shouldn't be overwhelming.
No, this when you see, it's the difference between seeing a bird and being like, that's a beautiful bird, and seeing a bird and just instantly knowing
Right.
internally, that's my mother.
Or I was thinking about this and then I saw this.
Hmm.
And the time closeness is that validator that
Yes.
this was a message.
So when you practice augury, it's again a process of reception, cataloging the results, and
Mm-hmm.
then not trying to make them, force them to fit, but just cataloging and observing.
Mm-hmm. And I do want to have a note here. There are plenty of like dictionaries that tell you the meanings of not just augury, but also dreams.
Hmm.
I would say that whenever you're interpreting something like that, think about what it means for you first, because
Exactly.
that's what matters. And then you can go ahead and look it up. I always look it up just to see. I think it's interesting.
Exactly. If you've gone through Isabel's tarot course, Isabel covers her the tarot very effectively, as well as all the symbolic meanings of the tarot. And then there's also the tarot methodology of reading the kind of imaginal messages that come to you immediately. So not necessarily being concerned about what the Queen of Cups means, but where's the Queen of Cups looking? Why is it the Queen of Cups? What's the story here in the
Mm-hmm.
cards? That imaginal interaction. Augury is very similar in that, and mediumship, I believe, to a degree, is similar in that the the meanings of butterflies, birds, snakes can be useful, and you should maybe know them or be able to consult with them. But if you see a snake and your immediate impulse is this means healing, go with that rather than the augury book saying that the snake means actually, death and destruction. You'll know there's a very obvious pointed difference.
Right. And for me, I've always liked snakes. And I'm going to take that, my personal feelings towards them, in the personal messages from the universe.
Exactly. So how can we improve our success rate? Because we've just given you a bunch of different concepts around mediumship, and we haven't, if you've noticed, talked about the traditional ones. We haven't talked about buying an oracle training card deck. We haven't talked about mediumship training cards. We haven't talked about even mental mediumship or physical mediumship or evidential mediumship. We've
Wow.
just been talking about some tools here. Those things we'll talk about in a later series.
Yeah, these are very accessible tools. We really, really wanted to cover them first, and because we use them all the time too. But we have a couple tips and tricks for improving working with these methods and practices. And one, I mean, this is said for all magical practices.
Yes.
I'm sure you've heard this a bunch of times already, but meditation is a fantastic practice for improving almost all things.
Yes, and almost all components of magic. Despite the fact that I do not like to meditate, and despite the fact that I put up a fight against it when I started magic, because who doesn't want to just go out and sling spells and curses and interesting, have experiments on the astral plane.
Yes.
It turns out the fastest way to improve doing magic is meditation.
Yes. And it's not as bad as you think. It's actually quite lovely.
Yes.
So meditation is the first step towards, I think, any spirit communication technique. It's certainly what we do in order to get in that receptive state. Your brain has to get in this kind of state in order to receive those messages.
And it is a different brain state. There have been studies showing different brain activity happening during automatic writing or during channeling.
Or mediumship, yep. And also it's really helpful just to become aware of the way your body is feeling before you do that. Because if you don't know what baseline is, you won't know how it's changed.
Exactly. And this becomes crucial as we move up the ladder. And in our next module on this, talk about mediumship proper as we imagine mediumship in the more colloquial conversation around it. If you're looking to be physically touched by spirits, or experience hot or cold, or experience these kind of physical manifestations.
Which is an important communication.
It is an important communication, an important communicative tool. But first we need to lay this groundwork of knowing what we feel like when we're not being touched by spirits or feeling those temperature fluctuations.
Right. I always have to scan for what is the temperature of my body? How do I feel? Often I'll learn that I'm sore and then I don't bring this into the messages.
Exactly. Again, ritual fasting, clean living, especially useful regarding scrying, can be useful across the board for mediumship, but we are not advocating that you do that. You can have just as much success doing pendulum work or dream manifestations of spirits or augury as you can if you go on a full vegetarian diet for a week.
Or
just
fast,
be aware that if you are medically able to fast and capable of enacting some of these clean living standards, you can have stronger communication, especially in regards to scrying. That's really what we wanted to get with here. You can play around with it. Again, do what feels best in this regard. And then recording messages for reflection, revisiting the time surrounding the connection. Again, time is weird, time is strange, especially for spirit. So focus on the week leading up to your session and the week after your session. Or if that feels too long, maybe 2 days before your session and 2 days after your session. And then see if anything that stands out to you directly relates to the messages you've received during your attempted communication.
Now, some things might be a bit bigger for you,
Hmm.
and I know magicians have recorded for up to years at a time.
Hmm.
Just to understand the cyclical nature of life and when these bigger patterns of your life are repeating, and that can be extremely useful.
Hmm. Exactly.
That's when you're going to use your Book of Shadows or your grimoire.
Exactly. And then lastly, create a ritual environment. If you can, have a spirit room, or a holy well, a place where there's lots of liminality, a place where you can go with the intent purpose of spirit communication. You can put altars in there and do ancestor offerings. It can just be a closet. It can just be a certain mat that you roll out on the floor, that when the mat is out, that's the spirit communication mat. And you can
Exactly.
put some sigils on it, or anoint it with the appropriate oils. This can all be used to boost spirit communication, but the
Mhm.
tools learn their job. So if you have a yoga mat that you use when you are, inducing to sit on when you're doing automatic writing, uh, that yoga mat will learn over time that when you use that yoga mat, spirit communication is going to occur. So consecrate your tools just in the same way you always would. And to the best you can, use them only for the purpose of spirit communication.
Yes, and I would just say that you can also set up an altar that helps you visually get into that state of spirit
Yes.
communication. Um, and that's something that we do for seances too. We bring that stuff that helps people get into that state, those dark colors, those candles, the pictures of the people that we want to communicate with. That can really help you get into that state faster.
From an occult perspective, mediumship is a ritual. It is a ritual in action. So if we treat it as a ritual, if we treat it as magic, these things can really light up.
Yep.
So how can we build spirit relationships? This is our last slide, and we've already talked a little bit about it. But these are some things we find are super useful as you engage in this path of spirit communication to build a relationship with spirit, with guides, with spirits you want to speak with entities, etc.
Yes, so we just talked a little bit about creation of a spirit room. That's where you're going to put all of your visuals. That's where you're going to put the mats and the comfortable chairs and dedicate that space for ritual workings.
And if it's just a closet, that's okay. And like I said earlier,
100%.
if it's just a mat that you roll out or a chair you sit in purely for spirit communication, this is all fine.
Absolutely. And one thing you can do to develop relationships is gifts to spirits of place. So, what does that mean?
Mhm.
Well, wherever you're living, you have some access to natural elements.
Yes.
Even if that's in a city, you might have a park nearby or even just a tree outside of your apartment.
Sure. Or a river that runs through the city.
Mm-hmm. And so you can actually have offerings to these places
Mhm.
to help show your thankfulness for the life that it gives you, the purifying air that it does for you, the water that it provides to you.
Yes. And by working with the spirits of place, we can kind of unlock those geographic magic as well as the
Yeah, that's another
benefits
course.
of the spirits. Another course entirely.
Yes, because places may have feelings about you.
Exactly.
And you want those feelings to be positive because those spirits of place are very old
Hmm.
and does not put up with anything.
Yeah. And then, of course, speaking of spirits, which we want to form interactions with, ancestor work. We talk a little bit about this in Appalachian folk magic course, and we'll be talking. I know Isabel has a ancestor magic course as well uploaded here. But doing that ancestor work can really help bolster. It can help us find guides. It can help us create channels of communication, kind of create well-worn paths or roads towards stronger communication.
Right, and that just can look like a daily offering of water or a lighting of a candle and just remembering the ancestors and their wishes for you to prosper and thrive.
Right. And now there's also the element of plugging into seasons and planetary hours. So if you know your astrological correspondences through your grimoire or through your Book of Shadows, if you know the planetary hours for the entities you're trying to work with, specifically here around angel magic or around entity communication for the purposes of spirit contact, plugging your sessions into that is super useful. And I think sometimes modern mediums, especially mediums who aren't engaged in like active magic,
Mhm.
uh, sometimes forget that there are entities out there or spirits out there that like to communicate through certain
Certain
instances,
times,
times,
days.
days. And if you can tap into that, it's like strapping just a big old satellite dish onto what you're doing. It's just a much stronger signal. It's an announcement, really, that much like doing the headless rite, it's an announcement that you are here and you are operant and you are willing to talk.
Yes. Oh gosh. I was no, I'm just thinking about the headless, right? um so cultivating body and a sense of awareness, we talked about this a little bit before, just knowing where your body stands
Mm-hmm.
before you meditate. This can be strengthened by having a regular practice with your body, such as yoga or a body scan part
Mm-hmm.
of a meditation, to learn about your body, to
Yeah,
connect with your body and understand how it feels, because magic is embodied and spirit communication is embodied.
that's correct.
So it's really helpful not just to think of you as a big brain.
As the John Mulaney sketch says, my body just exists to carry my head from room to room. We want to get away from that. We don't want to just have a body that carries our head from room to room.
No.
So this has been a module basically discussing spirit communication and the ways in which we encourage you to practice, even if you do mediumship. If you haven't engaged with scrying or you haven't engaged with pendulums or dream work, please try it.
Mm-hmm.
There is not one way to learn mediumship, and we will be doing a quarter 2 uh, module and course all about mediumship and all about physical mediumship, mental mediumship, evidential mediumship. But play with these concepts. If one doesn't work for you, it doesn't mean you can't be a medium. It doesn't mean you can't receive spirit messages.
Yeah.
Try all of them, see which ones work best, and then just keep zeroing in on that process of which ones work best.
Yeah. Have fun. Be safe.
Have fun. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.